The main character, named Estelle, was the illegitimate daughter of a duke, and so was born a commoner without any noble rights, and grew up on the streets. However, she became an archer of light in such a black world, as she awakened a divine power that was unrivaled in the empire. And because of this, the duke was able to increase his influence in society. The main character was constantly told not to cause unnecessary problems and to behave well, and also that she simply did not appear in noble society in front of people, as she could damage the reputation of the family. But the girl admitted to herself that she was used to it, so it didn't bother her, as her main task was to watch the light and control her divine power. Well, after beating her again, her sister started yelling about how the girl would go to animal feed, and absolutely did not understand how a girl like that could show up in this house. After that, I look around, the bowed main character said that she acted as if she was at least a little important. And apparently it was because everyone around her praised her and called her a saint. And so she decided that she was worth something in this world. But the girl only thought about the fact that she was sure that if she made enough effort, one day her family would accept her. And she endured every day their evil looks, full of disgust, and was herself several times on the verge of death. But she still prayed that someday her relatives would change their attitude towards her. And in this blind faith, the girl lived for many years. As a result, the people began to love and respect the girl, constantly calling her saint and admiring her generosity because she really was an example of divine light. Her sister smilingly addressed her by name and said that she had been a bit rude earlier, so she hoped that the girl would still be her sister and not take offense at them. So she asked, looking at the protagonist, to forget everything that had bound them together before. Estelle didn't know if her sister's apology was sincere, but it was enough for her to forgive. Bottom line, after a while, she fell in love with a young man who swore to her an eternal love and madly wanted to be her fiancé. And then the protagonist thought that perhaps she had received a similar reward for her patience. And the moment her family began to treat her better, and she also gained the love of her fiancé, the girl considered herself the happiest in the whole empire. But in the end, that happiness did not last long. So, after a while, the girl found herself chained to a pole and agitated, looking at her relatives with tears in her eyes. She did not understand why they were doing this to her, and said that it was all a misunderstanding, and turned to her sister for help. But her sister only grudgingly inquired how the girl dared to call her sister, and the girl, whom she considered her friend, only laughed and told Fiandra that it must have been insanely hard to have a rude sister of the more lowly origin. But at that moment, a huge eye appeared in the sky and scrutinized the crowd, if the people were going to offer him a sacrifice. And then, to the shock of the protagonist, Fiandra shouted that they wanted to give her life in exchange for a contract. The girl screamed and tried to break free in order to avoid such involvement. And at that moment, she noticed her fiancé in the distance, who just looked indifferently at this picture. She, still sobbing, called his name and asked him to save her, but in the end, he just turned around and walked away, completely uninterested in what was happening. At that moment, the devil's hands reached out to the girl, and addressing the relatives of the protagonist, he stated that people were really like devil's shadows, and they'd betrayed each other so easily and think only of themselves. But after carefully, and with some tenderness, looking at the protagonist demon, said that since the beginning of time he has not met such a pure soul, and therefore said that for such a rare sacrifice, he was ready to fulfill all wishes. And it seems that those who were ready to sacrifice the protagonist were madly happy about such a thing, and in the end they concluded contracts. The next moment, there was a heartbreaking scream of a girl. In the end, the devil moved her to his palace of Gehenna, where he happily flew over her and smiled at her, and addressed the protagonist as sweet and dear Estella. Then carefully looked her over and told her that they could stop, because it was just a shame, since it had been 600 years since the sacrifice, and he should have taken much better care of the protagonist during that time. But she, only scrutinizing the devil, asked what he was doing, and then he, seeing the girl's worried face, said that in fact her soul had already been destroyed, and therefore would soon perish. Then he said that the souls of criminals are tortured in Gehenna for 10,000 years, but it seems they paid too much attention to her. The devil smiled and said that despite her strength and purity, her soul was exhausted in only 600 years, which was really quite shameful by average standards. At this point, the girl only excitedly inquired, "Is she going to die soon?" On the devil, only releasing her true soul, said that although he was ashamed, but he really did not want to let the girl go, because after all, he will never see such a pure soul again. Then, when her soul was released, she shone insanely bright, and the devil offered her a look and told her that even after all the torture, her soul remained, still as radiant as ever. And then admiringly looking at this soul said that he did not understand what to do and how he could extinguish this light. But then with a sly smile said that he had one option, and so flew up to the girl and told her that while such an innocent soul as hers suffered in Gehenna, her enemies just went on with their happy lives, and asked if the girl would like to see it, to take a look at this. After that, the pictures floated around, where all her enemies were insanely happy, and seeing it, the main character was literally shocked. After that, the demon said that all these people receive happiness in exchange for the life of the girl. Then he showed her another picture of a man and a girl, and then the devil asked. The devil asked if it was not the man who had been her fiancé before, for he looked quite happy and was preparing everyone for the wedding, and his bride was Estelia's friend. Then he showed her sister and offered to look at Fiandra, informing her that she had had a lavish wedding right after she was chosen as the next saint, and said that the girl needed to see it all as well as possible, and to realize that these people had received the family happiness, which the girl had so much desired in her lifetime. And so he asked her what she thought about it, because no one really cared about the suffering she was going through. But at that moment, the protagonist only shouted angrily and asked him to stop. And the devil seems to be madly satisfied with such a reaction, and then approached and asked if the protagonist would like to take revenge, and said that he would send her to the happiest moments of these people to take his revenge, and it sounds pretty good. But the girl only wondered why he would do something like that. And the devil calmly spun in flight around Estelle and said that everything was simple enough, because they all wanted the light of her soul to fade forever. And so she had to crush her enemies and make them suffer. After all, she would die anyway, and so she could at least in her last moments do what she wanted. After that, the devil, smiling cunningly, said that it was probably hard for the girl to refuse such an offer, and told her that it was best to just agree, and asked her to still want such a sweet revenge. At this moment, the protagonist, with a smile looking at the devil, said that she really wanted it, and besides simple revenge, she wanted pain, death of these people, desperate screams. At this moment, the devil only joyfully flew and began to circle near Estella. Then looking at her carefully said that he would give her the devil's blessing, and all her wishes would be fulfilled. Then he told the girl that it was really incredible that the saint was able to get the devil's blessing, and said that when she opens her eyes, she will find her special gift, and this gift will be the most desirable one. So the devil really hoped that the girl could be happy. In this world where the protagonist lived, the power of the great empire was divided between the imperial family and the 6 dukes. And the 6 dukes were given precious eyes to symbolize each family. The most powerful family in the empire was the Garnet family, which symbolized power. The symbol of good health was carried by the Damon family and was also called prosperity. The representatives of God and religion were the Emerald family, who were considered a blessing. The power of justice went to the Sapphire family, and they symbolized enthusiasm. The controlling magicians were amethysts, or what they called the abyss. They had the trust of angels, and they were also the guardians of the law. This family was also called the Shining Family, and the power of the 6 dukes was stronger than even the imperial family. But there were those who coveted that power the most, and their miserable greed led them to the devil. And in the end, the most noble soul of Street, Estella, was sacrificed to their greed. But the protagonist, even during her life, did not live well, for the treatment of her in that family was really terrible, and it was an insanely difficult time to live there. For even 10 years before the sacrifice, her sister had been mocking her in every possible way, and having thrown the girl on the ground, gloatingly looked at her and only informed her that such poses suited her as much as possible. It was Fiandra. After which this girl stepped her foot on the arm of the protagonist, not allowing her to rise from her seat. At that moment, Marriott Damon looked at her and laughed, asking if Fiandra thought it was funny that her sister could look so ordinary, even in expensive dresses, because it was probably the case when Origin could really decide everything. But the protagonist only bowed her head in silence at such an insult and decided to bear it. And then a surprised Marriott Damon asked Fiandra why. No matter what they did, the girl did not react. After all, she literally had goosebumps from such fortitude of the protagonist. But Fiandra, madly unhappy looking at her sister, said that she absolutely does not understand how such a creature like her sister could become the greatest holy empire. Then she turned around and called the girl to follow her, saying that they had nothing to do here, as it was useless to even talk to the protagonist, and it was just a waste of time. When the girl was alone after such abuse, she thought about the fact that she was absolutely always surrounded by lies, because she had no love or affection from Duke Emerald, her father. Everyone around her called her the noble saint and the shining star. But that was never true, for even to her own family, she was nothing more than a commoner and a thief who stole the blessing of Emerald. Although the protagonist, despite all her sad and suffering life, had one person who took her side, and it was a child with whom the protagonist met by chance. After that, they somehow managed to become friends. Then the girl, as usual, coming to the garden, thought that she would like to meet the boy, as she would be madly sad if Yusin Peridot left. Yusin Peridot was the only successor of the angels, and the ducal heir needed to lead the blood awakening ritual. Of course, Yusin Peridot had to do it too, and because of an incident during the ritual, he had to leave to take the test. But suddenly, distracting her from her thoughts, a little boy appeared in front of her, looking at her with his pure gold eyes. When the girl saw him, she immediately started to look at him in astonishment, and after looking at him, she asked him if his preparations for departure had been completed. But he only calmly said that his trial would begin tomorrow. At this point, the protagonist sadly announced that she realized that he would have to leave soon. Whereupon she took out a small bag with unknown contents and held it out to the boy. Then immediately accepted then with great trepidation and began to look at it. And then the protagonist, seeing this face, awkwardly thought that apparently the boy did not much like what was there. But then when he took it out, he saw that there was a dessert and immediately began to eat it, and said that he absolutely liked everything. The protagonist, only looking at such, Yusin Peridot apologized to him for not being able to please him, because she wanted to prepare for him his favorite chocolate before leaving. But he only smiled happily and then told the protagonist that everything was fine, because whatever she gave him, it would definitely be delicious. Estelle smiled happily when she heard this and told the boy that he was really cute and she was glad she could please him. But at that moment, their dialogue was interrupted by an excited maid, who ran up to the young gentleman and told him that he had run away again. Although he had to get ready for the road, he only looked at his maid and asked her unhappily, why should they be in such a hurry, for he had not even had time to speak to Street Estella. At this moment, the girl, realizing that Yusin Peridot just didn't want to leave, looked at him and said with a smile that they would definitely meet in 10 years. So he must pass the test and also return safe and sound. Then, looking into his slightly embarrassed face, she told him that when she arrived, she would buy him his favorite chocolate. But at that moment, the girl grabbed him by the arm and led him away, informing him that they really had to hurry and asking why he had run away again. But it didn't seem to bother him at all, so he turned to the girl one last time and waved to her and told her that he would be back in one piece, and then she would have to fulfill her part of the promise. At that moment, the girl had no idea that on that day, the farewell they had made to each other was the last of her life. In the end, the protagonist prayed for Yusin Peridot more than once and wished that everything would be fine and he would be happy. And at that time, Estelle had no idea that on that day she had descended into hell after all, and that her life would end this way because of someone else's unknown ambitions. Reflecting on her past, the protagonist only stated that she was insanely stupid and naive, and it was foolish to believe that someday something would change, and it was because of her kindness that she found herself in a terrible position. And then the protagonist, remembering everything that happened, absolutely did not understand how it could happen to her, how her family could betray her, and also about her fiancé, who abandoned her at the first opportunity in order to be with another. And the demon, who, no matter how much it tormented her, still offered her the opportunity for revenge so that she could fulfill the revenge. And then the protagonist thought that she absolutely had to take revenge, to avenge all those who have caused her grief, and she must carry out the most terrible and most ruthless revenge in the world. At that moment, the girl with scarlet eyes woke up and did not know where she was, and could not understand why her whole body absolutely did not obey and did not realize where she was. Then memories crept into her head with her madly frightened horse that threw her off the carriage. And then the girl realized that she was supposed to go back to the mansion after her meeting with the crown prince, but something had gone wrong. But at that moment, she was given a huge shock by an insanely familiar voice, which stated that they were madly. It's been a long time. The girl immediately shook. I don't understand. That voice really belonged to Estella. And then looked up and she literally sobbed, not believing what she was seeing, and said that it was simply impossible because she had been told earlier that Estelle had long since died. But the protagonist only looked at her with contempt and wondered, did she really think she was dead? Then she asked what it was like to see the living dead. But the agitated noblewoman only shouted at Estella and wondered how a saint like her could use black magic, since it was forbidden. and then angrily inquired where she had sent her and where they were now. But the protagonist was clearly unhappy with the girl's behavior, so she smiled wickedly and told her that the girl, apparently she didn't understand her situation yet and where she was. After that, she applied dark magic on the girl, and as a consequence of this, magic spikes began to spread all over her body, enveloping her and piercing her skin. And flowers bloomed on her arms, neck, and face, which meant the application of magic. Looking at it all, the girl had absolutely no idea what was happening to her, and so she just stared in surprise all around her. But the next moment, the protagonist finished her spell, and because of such a thing, the girl screamed in horror and ordered the protagonist to stop. Then, with shaking hands, asked why she was doing that to her and what she had done to her. Looking at such a picture, Estelle was only displeased, thinking about the fact that Irenia Garnet, the Duke's daughter, constantly pretended to be on her side and was like a little sister to her. But in doing so, she betrayed her. At that moment, the devil approached her and with a smile asked the girl if he could take her soul for himself. After all, the devil wanted to drive this girl to despair. After that, the devil turned to the frightened girl and informed her that the devil who destroys fallen souls had been waiting for her for a long time, and it was time to pay for her sins. And at that moment, the excited girl could think of nothing better to do than to grab the protagonist by her dress. Then she looked panic-stricken and wondered if the protagonist really wanted to give her soul to the devil. Then she apologized to her for doing so and admitted that she was wrong. Seeing her frightened face, the protagonist asked with contempt, was she scared now? And then she calmly said that she had gone to hell because of her insignificance and had endured 600 years of torment there. Then, using her magic, she asked if the girl felt that she too should feel her pain for betraying her. In the end, the magic was insanely strong and literally separated the soul from the body. And so with tears in her eyes, Irenia burned because of the immense pain. The girl screamed at the top of her voice. Looking at her pain, Estelle calmly explained what was really going on in Gehenna and said that the demons there mock people as if they were their toys as well. They're supposed to keep an eye on the broken souls. After which the protagonist asked with a smile if the girl could imagine the pain she had gone through, but she was still desperately begging to be saved. And at that moment, shocking Aurelia herself, Estelle agreed. She was only excited, rising from her seat and asking if she was really ready to help. Then she tearfully said that she believed that Estelle was as kind as she once was and said that she would always owe her a favor she would never forget. But having given her hope, Estelle also quickly took it away and only grudgingly asked Irenia Garnet what she was talking about. She didn't mean it. Her soul was long lost and literally not worthy to live in this world. The next moment, the devil's hands began to reach for the girl from everywhere to take her to the world of the dead. And at the last moment, when they wrapped around her whole body, Aurora Garnet, only excitedly looking at the protagonist, inquired why the girl had tricked her and what it was about. But she only calmly turned around and said that it would be fair enough if she went through the same pain she had experienced earlier. Whereupon her hair darkened, her eyes turned red, and she became an exact replica of Aurelia Garnet. And with a smile turned to her and told her that she would borrow her body until then and advised her to watch her actions from Gehenna. Eventually morning came and opened the eyes of the protagonist, who was now Irenia, and still could not get used to the fact that she was a different person. After all, remembered that it had been 3 years since she was sacrificed, and her death explains that she took the torture to defeat the darkness. She sat down on the sofa and thought about the fact that the status of the 6 dukes hadn't changed, and no one had found out the truth because no one cared. And then she realized that there was only one reason for her success. This girl was the youngest daughter of the Duke of Garnet. She was the youngest daughter of Duke Garnet, the most powerful family in the empire, and no one would dare to treat her badly, and no one expected anything from her, because Irenia Garnet was just such a daughter. Then she thought that it was the right time for revenge. As a result, the girl was now at a meal. With her family, the excited maid accidentally dropped the plate she was supposed to put on the table, and then her disgruntled cousin Barnet looked at her and wondered how many times it would happen again. After that, he told his father that this girl always does this and keeps breaking and spilling everything when she brings the food. But his father said calmly that it must have been an accident and asked his son not to make any noise at the table. He only calmly said that it must have been an accident and asked his son not to make any noise at the table. At which point the protagonist looked at him carefully and wondered how the real Aurelia Garnet should have reacted at that moment. She did not know what to say of the maid's mistake. Then looked closely at her cousin, thought that Hamilton was her cousin, and excitedly, looking at him, wondered Did he really have such a terrible temper? But at that moment, her uncle looked at her carefully and asked if she was well and if she had a headache after the accident. But she calmly smiled and said that she was really well and had already fully recovered. But the next moment, to her great shock, she saw the divination card that hung over the maid. And then she thought that it was that devil's power to foretell the future. And the card suggested an approaching tragedy. And then, quietly drinking her tea, the girl thought that perhaps something bad was about to happen and wondered if she should take the opportunity. The maid ended up apologizing tearfully to Hamilton in the evening and admitting her guilt for spilling everything all the time and being ready literally. But it seems that the guy was undeterred and continued to beat her, just shifting his anger on her. The girl, still crying, asked him to have mercy. After all, she didn't want to argue with him at all. But her hands then were really just slippery, so the plate slipped. And she was ready to swear on her life that she was absolutely not lying. But the disgruntled young man only grabbed her hair to inform her that all commoners were like that, and he wasn't going to forgive her that easily. But at that moment, he shifted his gaze somewhere in the distance and seemed genuinely surprised, because the protagonist appeared before him, and then the guy excitedly looked at her and asked her what she was doing here, and asked her to leave. But she calmly said that she absolutely did not like what she saw, and therefore she did not intend to leave. Then magically informed me that she wanted to stay here and watch and decide what to do with her dear cousin. As a result, moments later, the excited maid watched the thorny vines braid Hamilton's entire body and strangle him, while he weepingly tried to tear them off and begged the girl to stop. But she didn't even seem to think about it, and just looked at the young man with contempt, thinking that she had probably overdone it. Although for Gehenna, such an attitude was still quite mild, but she thought that she should be more careful from now on, since she was in the normal world after all. But at that moment, the girl approached him, and then the excited Hamilton asked who she really was. And she looked at his horrified face and told him that she was the sane Aurenia. But thanks to this power, she had recently survived an approaching death. And now she was ready to give her brother two options. The first one was just to die and go to hell, but there was one. And the second was to become her slave. She asked him what he would choose. Then, looking at his shocked face, she said that Hamilton would have to decide much sooner, because he could disappear mysteriously or continue to live, but still be her slave. Then, rising from her seat, informed her that it was up to him, and she hoped frantically that he would admit his mistakes and accept his punishment. But at that moment, he grabbed her by the hem of her dress and told her that he understood completely. Then he shouted that he would go to his father and fall on his knees and take responsibility for everything. But the protagonist only looked at him unhappily and wondered what he was talking about, because she said she was advising him to die, and he had absolutely no right to tell anyone. Then she made a small incision in her palm and told him that if he was so eager to continue his worthless life, he should just drink her blood, and then he would become a slave and stay one forever. But she warned him and told him to think about it as best he could. But it seems Hamilton was not even going to ponder, and so in the very next moment, he leaned his face into the floor in order to lick the blood that the protagonist had spilled. And looking at this unpleasant picture, the girl thought about the fact that the guy was really insanely pathetic. But after calmly walking past him, informed him that now that he had drunk her blood, their contract was concluded. Then coming closer to him and lifting his face to herself, said that from this moment, Hamilton's soul will forever belong to her. After which the guy began to scream insanely hard, as at this moment, his body was pierced by pain, which was caused by dark magic of the main character. After a time, two strange men were walking in the place where the protagonist had previously been with Hamilton, and the man, looking at the ground beneath him, reported that he sensed a darkness unknown to him here, and he was sure that a darkness lurked in the vicinity. After carefully looking at the place where the man was pointing, his assistant said that he did not feel any darkness at all. Then, scrutinizing the young man, he asked if it was possible that he had sensed something wrong. Although it was even strange, this guy was the star of the family, the supreme judge of the Yuuzhan Peridot Empire. At that moment, taking off his glasses to wipe them, Yuuzhan Peridot said that he must have really just made a mistake, or the darkness was so strong that he simply could not feel it. But then the excited young man, looking into Yuuzhan Peridot's face, asked if there really is something in this world that could have such strong dark magic. He said calmly that he was mistaken, and probably because of the stress, he had become too susceptible. But then an agitated assistant asked, did something like this have to do with an incident 3 years ago? And he still blames himself for that incident. But a worried Yuuzhan Peridot only wondered if he could have forgotten about it, and then sadly, He looked down and said that the girl had died in such a manner, and that it was simply unforgivable. But looking into his troubled face, the assistant said that it was not his fault at all, as he could not have prevented the death of the saint. But the guy only remembers the past that connected them, and said that his assistant has no idea how much he missed her because he watched her from afar and held back for 10 years. Hearing about it, he seemed to realize immediately that, in fact, Yusin Peridot was actually just in love with this girl. But then he stopped him from making any unnecessary comments and said that they still didn't know what was going on, and therefore they should be more careful in the future. Therefore, if he really wasn't wrong, then the worst catastrophe would come, which had only happened before in hell. Then the excited young man looked at him and asked what they would do if his fears were indeed confirmed. But Yusin Peridot only hesitated for a while, and then with a determined glance at his assistant said that in that case he would have to deal with it and risk everything. But the next moment something distracted him, and he saw a small scrap of cloth lying about the place. And picking it up, Yusin Peridot began to scrutinize the cloth, trying to understand how it had come to be there. Eventually it was morning, and the maid was helping the girl get ready and informed her that her hair was finally nicely styled, and now all they had to do was pick out outfits. But the protagonist only smiled and told the maid that she didn't know which one to choose today, and asked if she could help her. The girl only happily agreed, and then immediately turned away and went. But the next moment she was approached by one of the excited maids who asked why the girl was behaving so strangely. But she only looked madly surprised, and then the maid explained that the mistress she was serving was not a very nice person. But the maid assured her colleague that it was all right, as she was sure that inside Aurania Barnett was really very kind, and reported certainly the mistress had changed a lot. Then the protagonist, who had heard their entire conversation perfectly, thought about how she was insanely nervous since she was doing something like this for the first time. But so far everything was going well enough. And then remembering last night, she thought she was about to start the memory wipe, but she saw the sincerity on the maid's face, which screamed her desire to serve her. And then she kept her memories of the gratitude she felt towards the protagonist for saving her, after which she thought that she could later use this maid as a henchwoman, eventually some more. After a while, the protagonist found herself in the dining hall and thought about the fact that it was finally time for the Duke's dinner, and today she had to kill that whole family. But suddenly a servant ran up to her excitedly and informed the lady that the Viscount had returned from the kingdom. The protagonist only smiled and said that in that case they should get ready and need to go and greet her father. Eventually, as they walked towards her, the excited maid and awkwardly inquired why she had so suddenly decided to see her father, and whether everything was all right. But the protagonist only wondered what was unsurprisingly her maid so reacted, because Viscount and Aurania Garnet had a strained relationship, and there was no strong father-daughter bond between them. And even on the contrary, in the past, Aurania Garnet constantly blamed her father for the death of her own mother. And those were the times when the girl showed her at least a little of her real feelings. And the moment she listened to her, Estelle even thought she found a way to reconcile them. But now this girl's father was just another pawn in her game, which she would immediately use for her speedy victory over her enemies. Bottom line, after a while they approached the house where Aurania Garnet's father lived. A surprised servant asked why they came so suddenly and what happened. But the protagonist only smilingly said that she was going to say hello to her father. She asked the servant to tell him that she had come, but he only asked excitedly what she wanted to talk to him about. Aurania Garnet seemed madly displeased at such a question, so she looked angrily at the servant in front of her and told him that her father had returned and she, as his daughter, should greet him, and wondered if the servant thought it was obvious enough. Seeing her stern face, he immediately began to stammer and gave way and asked her to come inside. After a short walk down the long corridors of his estate, a gentleman knocked on the door and said that his daughter had come to speak to him. And then the man, adjusting his bow tie to look his best, told the servant that he could let his daughter in. It was Enrique, the Garnet family diplomat. Seeing him, the protagonist thought that this man was insanely similar to Aurania Garnet. But the difference between them was only in one thing. Compared to the girl, the soul of this man was honest and therefore insanely brightly shone, and she saw it perfectly. Then, looking at his confident face, she thought that she would be sorry to use such a man. But suddenly a question came from him to the protagonist. The man asked her what she had forgotten in this house. The man asked her what she was doing in this house, and she was quite shocked by the question, after which she bowed and said that she had come to say hello, and he asked excitedly. But the protagonist only excitedly lowered her gaze and confirmed his guess, after which she said that while her father was away, she was thinking about her mistakes, and awkwardly apologized for making him worry, but he only looked confidently at the girl in front of him and informed her that he was sure she hadn't come here just to apologize and wondered what she needed. She thought about it and then said that today she wanted to say goodbye to her grandfather for the last time because she didn't know when he would die. And so she wanted to apologize to him for everything that had happened. That agitated, looking around, her father thought a little and informed that if his daughter really desired it, they had better ask his uncle first in order to get his permission. In the end, after a while, they went to Garnet's uncle, and the joyful man looked at the main character and her father and said that he hadn't seen them for a long time, and his son Hamilton, who was standing behind him, seemed to be frightened when he saw the girl. At this point, the protagonist smiled sweetly and said that they were really crazy. The man only said that every time he saw the girl, she was getting better and better. Then he said that if things continued like this, she would soon become the most beautiful girl in the empire. She only smiled affectionately and thanked her brother-in-law for that. Then, looking over his smiling face, she stated that the Earl was the heir to the Garden family, and outwardly he seemed to be an insanely nice man, but he had obtained his status by sacrificing to the devil. And that victim was, of course, her. And so the girl couldn't even believe that he was really like that and couldn't accept it to the last. But in the end, she didn't get out of her character and smiled at her uncle, saying that she had a small favor to ask him, and asked if she could visit her grandfather before the banquet tonight. But he was madly surprised at such a request, and then awkwardly informed her that it would probably not be possible to hold such a meeting. At which point the conversation was interrupted by her father, who inquired if his daughter could see her grandfather even for a little while. But the Count only awkwardly informed that the doctor had previously said that no one should be allowed into his room, so he really had no choice. But a disgruntled Enrique only said that it really wouldn't take long, because their father really loved his granddaughter very much. So when he met her, he would be really happy. At this point, the protagonist, lowering her sad gaze, said that she had done a lot of things in her past, so she wanted to apologize to him personally. Seeing such a distraught girl, the Count excitedly informed that his father's health had indeed lately become quite bad. But suddenly into the conversation entered madly frightened Hamilton, who informed his father that he agreed with the girl, and their grandfather absolutely considered Avrenia Garnet his favorite granddaughter, and therefore was sure that she would be pleased. Then the Count, agreeing with his son, allowed the girl to do so. And so she found herself in this room, and scrutinizing the Duke thought about the fact that it had only been 3 years, and he had already become so haggard, and looking at his haggard face, absolutely could not believe that this was the man who was capable of anything. After that, she took out her knife and decided to test some of her theories and applied a magic spell on it. After making a small cut, the knife immediately began to flash with multicolored magic, and looking at it, the protagonist said that it was quite an interesting development. Then she looked at the man in front of her and thought that he was finally being punished for his sins, because he was the only one responsible for the empire turning into a nightmare. Because initially their empire was prosperous and correctly distributed the balance of power between the 6 dukes and the imperial family, and thus the empire was able to achieve incredible success. However, the balance was broken by the Duke, and through his fault the ruling family was destroyed. And since then their empire has fallen into the depths of hell. Then, looking at the man in front of her with an insanely contemptuous look, Avrenia Garnet wondered if he should have gone to Gehenna a long time ago as well. After looking at him, carefully noticed that around him demons have already begun to circle around him, who were waiting for his death, and stated that all the demons of this place have long been waiting for his early death. Then she, bending over him, informed him that he would be cursed even by demons, and he should feel the pain of all the innocent people who screamed at his fault. When she came out of his room, where her uncle and her father were waiting for her, the girl said that she had already said goodbye. Then she said that she thought that her grandfather was really happy to see her, because he opened his eyes and said something to her. Upon hearing this, her uncle was madly surprised and excitedly inquired. Garnet was only calmly informed that her grandfather had indeed spoken quite clearly. Then, looking at the man with a madly attentive glance of her scarlet eyes, she stated that the Count was getting nervous, and it was not strange, since he was responsible for the death of his father. At this point, standing up for the protagonist, her father said that Aurora Garnet really couldn't have been wrong, and so most likely their father had already woken up. The Count, only agitated, began to stutter, and said that earlier he had just thought that the forecast was correct, so he didn't expect this. At that moment, the main character, distracting them from such a serious conversation, smiled and said that it would be better to discuss it when they all gathered for a meal, and then they would talk about everything. In the end, the protagonist, having changed with the help of her maid into other clothes suitable for dinner, was going to the dining room, and the excited girl wondered if her mistress was comfortable. And the latter assured that everything was fine, and she was really having a pleasant time. But then she was approached by a lady who inquired since when had Arania Garnet become so courteous, for she had always been absolutely not. She was a baroness who managed the maids in the Garnet family. The protagonist calmly looked at her and told her that they hadn't seen the baroness for a long time, and the woman only smilingly said that their master was worried sick about the girl. She only smiled and said that she had only come to see her grandfather, whereupon the baroness smiled and said that she was madly curious as to what the Duke had said. And she added that however Arania Garnet was to be empress soon, and apparently for that reason she had changed. Her father, who came up just in time to tell the baroness that she should not behave in such a way with his daughter, thanked her for her interest, but told her that he was in charge of his daughter's upbringing. After that, the protagonist, looking at the bowed baroness, thought that perhaps this woman was still here only because they shared a common bloodline, although she was insanely unpleasant. At that moment, the bowed baroness awkwardly said that she understood the remark and apologized for being rude. But Arania Garnet only smiled happily and said that nothing had happened, and that the whole situation had arisen because of the baroness's insane concern for her. Then she thought that such a relationship had nothing to do with her. But missing the situation, the girl headed for lunch, at which point the excited uncle said he had something important to report before they started, whereupon he summoned the doctor. Then the man who came out to them said that he was the Duke's personal doctor, and he would like to report that his condition had begun to deteriorate decisively. At this point, the protagonist's worried father asked how serious his illness was, and the doctor only awkwardly bowed his head and informed him that if things continued, the Duke would have no more than 6 weeks left, and he was madly sorry that his life could not be saved. But at that moment, he was stared at by Aurora Garnet, who wondered how sure the man was of this. The excited uncle, only looking at this picture, asked the girl why she was asking about it. This young man was the Duke's personal physician, but she calmly said that when she was with her grandfather, he told her he wished he lived a little longer, and that phrase horrified the Count. After that, the girl, putting the knife on the table carefully and looking at it, said that for this reason she decided to secretly check something, but did not expect such a result. And carefully showing them what was on the table, informed them that this knife was of magical material, and even a little poison could cause such a reaction, and asked if they should believe the words of a charlatan who doesn't even know that his patient has been sent away. On hearing this, the excited doctor only informed the lady that her joke had gone too far, and it could not be true, so asked her to stop. But she was madly serious, looking at him inquiringly, whether her words were like a joke, whereupon she explained her words and informed him that the whole matter was an inheritance, and if it happened for some order, the safety of the Earl's heir would be in doubt. At that moment, the father of the protagonist rose from his seat and said that the guards should immediately grab the doctor and interrogate him, but he only excitedly explained that he had absolutely no knowledge of everything that was happening. But at this point, the protagonist said that they couldn't just grab this doctor, because it wasn't that simple, because the traitor was still among them, and reported that this poison was manufactured, and the color seems to grow in the south, so its toxicity was extremely low. So if you don't take it for a long time, the effects will wear off. So she said that moreover, this poison must be mixed carefully with food in small doses. And she bowed her head and began to ponder the fact that there was only one person in the mansion who could do such a thing, and it was the Baroness who personally looked after the Duke. At that moment, without even waiting for orders, the guards began to take her out of the dining hall and into the dungeon, and she only burst out excitedly and swore that she was absolutely innocent and that it was not her doing. At that moment, the protagonist was looked at by her own uncle with an insanely murderous look, and she said that the murder at the Garnet Mansion was a truly horrible incident, and asked her uncle for his opinion. The Duke's poisoning really shocked the whole family as each of them tried to find the culprit, but the Baroness, who was now in custody, never said anything, and constantly asserted that she knew absolutely nothing. Thinking about it, the protagonist realized that apparently the Baroness had expected to be saved by the Count, then smilingly thought that they were insanely lucky that she had been able to discover this. Otherwise, the Duke had died without even a single witness. After that, she was about to eat her dessert and realized that all this was already pointless, as she had changed the fate of this man. But suddenly she was approached by her father, who said that the girl grew up really great. But she only got flustered, looking around at the men in front of her, wondering what father wanted from her, and he calmly informed her that he had come to talk and tell her something. Sitting down opposite her father excitedly inquired how the girl had realized that the Duke had been poisoned. She only looked at him intently and inquired, but the father said that it was impossible for the girl to have information about poisons. The protagonist calmly reported that she learned about it from Street Estella when she visited her, but after seriously adding that how she learned about it, where she learned it from, and who told her, it was absolutely nothing to do with her father. After that, having carefully looked at his shocked face, she informed him that they didn't care where Estelle got the information from, and said that the man shouldn't worry, because what had happened wouldn't shake his reputation. But the man with the shaking hands inquired, did his daughter think he was worried about his honor? Because he simply couldn't leave things as they were, and suggested that she go straight to the kingdom right away. She calmly looked at him and told him that she was not going to do that. When her father heard this, he immediately got up from his seat and said that his duty was to protect his daughter, and if she became a duchess, he would definitely have to pay for such an act. The girl only scrutinized him and wondered, did her father mean that her uncle was going to kill her, just as he had poisoned her mother? He was really shocked when he heard about it, but the protagonist calmly said that she knew about it, and knew that it was the Count who killed her mother, and that's why. Apparently, her father was worried that the same thing would happen to her, and inquired, why would they run away in that case? And looked him over carefully, asked, does he suggest that she run away just because he is used to it, and has lived like that all his life? He literally could not say a word. And then the girl went on and said that she certainly understood that it was all for his sake, but she wasn't sure if it was right to do that, because bowing down to an enemy was not what she wanted to do, and that the body's owner's own uncle might have killed her, and had also previously tried to kill her grandfather just to take over. She reflected that she had absolutely no idea how the real Aurelia Garnet might be feeling right now, who might have been watching, but she didn't even want to know. And then the protagonist nobly rose to her seat and said that she would never be happy if she continued to run away from her enemies or bow down to them, and asked her father to think. She realized that she had just provoked the Viscount himself by her words and actions. At the same time, Yusin Peridot and his servant were riding in a carriage, and his assistant told him that the ceremony of farewell to the Duke would take place very soon, and asked what had changed in Yusin Peridot's decision, because he had originally said that he did not want to go there, and asked why he suddenly changed his mind. But the young man, looking around him rather boredly, informed him that they had earlier detected the appearance of darkness, and there was a piece of fabric from a dress in the warehouse, and so they might be able to find its owner. Then, carefully taking off this cloth, the man informed them that the warehouse was on the grounds of the Garnet family, and if they wanted to find the mistress of this dress, they should have start looking in this very place. But then the servant asked what they would do in case they did manage to find the owner of the dress. But Yusin Peridot calmly looked at him and asked. The young man had already forgotten their purpose, and then looking carefully at his worried face, he said that their main task was to kill this girl. At this time, the protagonist is standing on the roof watching the carriage that came to their yard, and thinking that the demon really did not lie, and she, having been sacrificed, and after receiving a gift from the devil, shone brighter than all the others. Eventually, a carriage pulled into the courtyard, and then the butler announced that the head of the family, Grand Duke Yusin Peridot, had appeared. Then bowing, thanked the man for accepting their invitation. He said that it was a great honor for them that he had decided to come and say goodbye to the Duke. Aurenia looked admiringly at the young man and said that he had grown up a lot. After all, the last time they'd met, he'd still looked like a little puppy, and she'd gotten letters from him before, but meeting him in person was so much better. Then, looking at him thoughtfully, she realized that if it weren't for the situation she was in, she would have gone to greet him a long time ago. Then she thought that it was with this man she had to be as careful as possible. But the next moment he turned and looked at her intently. And at that moment, looking into his attentive gaze, the protagonist was embarrassed, not realizing that she had just been noticed. In this world, the Grand Duke family is the reincarnation of angels on Earth, and their mission for over hundreds of years was to destroy the great demon. It was the basis of the contract they made to help them survive, as well as their duty. And the protagonist realized that's why she couldn't meet this young man without repercussions, even in spite of this history that bound them together. Then, walking resolutely to her room, she thought that she wished madly she could pretend they didn't know each other at all, but one of them had to die. As a result, the next day the protagonist came to the kitchen, and the excited maid asked her what the girl was doing, and she calmly explained that she wanted to make chocolate for their dear guests who decided to visit them. And as the maid watched the process, at that moment, having finished making the chocolate, she asked the girl to shape the chocolate and cool it down. And the girl just clapped her hands happily and asked the mistress to rely on her because she could do it. The first thing she did when she left the kitchen was to meet Jusen Paradibitu and his assistant. The assistant, smiling happily, told Autria Garnet that he had not expected to see her here at all. And the girl only looked at Jusen with embarrassment and could not believe that they had met so suddenly. So she thought that perhaps she should have waited for another duke in the living room. But at that moment, the young man looked at her and smiled and said that Arenia Garnet smelled sweet enough, and that's why he was sure that the dessert was ready. But the protagonist said that it was, because they had people coming to them from far away, and they needed to be well taken care of. Then thinking about the maid who was now making chocolate, Arenia Garnet stated that it wasn't just making chocolate, but a type of black magic that sealed the soul. After all, she had added a bit of her blood to the chocolate when making it, and it was unlikely that Yusin Peridot would notice it, but it would help her immensely in the future. Then Yusin Peridot said that he usually entrusted such work to maids, but the girl bowed and said that she could not entrust someone with a job in which such sincerity was important. After that, she carefully looked at the young man and asked him what the reason for his arrival was. But seeing her attentive gaze, he reacted strangely enough and just silently stared at her without understanding what was going on with him. This reaction was noticed by his excited assistant, who asked if he was all right. And at that moment, the man bowed and left immediately and said that he was going first. And then the protagonist, looking fearfully after him, thought that perhaps he was able to recognize her true identity and who she really was. But then she thought about the fact that it couldn't have happened because her rank was much higher with the light and dark ranks. So Yusin Peridot wouldn't recognize her until she saw her using magic. Even so, she would have to be careful. At the same time, the assistant looked awkwardly at Jusen Peridot and asked what he was thinking about and why he was behaving so strangely. But the man only said with a kind of sadness in his face that he absolutely did not understand what it was connected with. Then his assistant asked why he did not know and whether he had decided not to use the Eye of Justice. But he, thinking about it, said that even if he had used the eye, he had not felt any magical power anyway, although he could not be completely sure of it. Then, wiping his eyes under his glasses, he thought that the great demon had the power to deceive, even the eyes of justice, and moreover he had some vague feeling. The assistant asked what it was about, but he informed that it was not something so important. But all the while he was walking and remembering the eyes of Arenia Garnet, and he thought that he did not understand why, when their eyes met, he felt something had changed. And it would seem that this girl was an entirely different person. So reminding him of his late beloved Estella, he thought that he had a great pain in his chest when he thought about it. But after he had collected himself, he told his assistant that they had to be as careful as possible about Arenia Garnet, as it was still unclear if the girl was connected to this. Eventually, after the Grand Duke arrived, the whole family gathered here with Duke Amethyst or otherwise Abyss present. Also Duke Emerald family blessings, as well as Duchess Damon's prosperity and Duke Sapphire's enthusiasm. At that moment, the protagonist, joyfully handing them a tray of chocolates that she had prepared, asked them to taste them and said that they were very welcome in their home and were grateful that they had decided to attend the farewell ceremony. A flustered Marriott Damon just ogled Garnet asked if she had made something like this herself, but she informed them that she wasn't that talented, so the flavor might not be perfect, but assured them that she had really put her heart into it. At that moment, the girl, tasting the chocolate, admiringly remarked that it was really delicious and informed her fiancé that he absolutely had to try it. Arenia Garnet looked around at them with a smile and thought that even personally observing their friendly faces, her heart was no longer wavering. Then, remembering her past, she realized that it had all been long forgotten by her, and so she didn't care at all about being associated with this young man. But the next moment she was called by her aunt, who looked at her unhappily and asked what she was doing here, and then grabbed her by the arm and began to lead her out. And Arenia Garnet only looked around at the arriving guests and thought that she hadn't yet made sure that everyone tasted her chocolate. But she thought about the fact that people ate chocolate without a single doubt. But she still didn't understand where her aunt was taking her. The next moment, as soon as they were alone, the woman slapped the girl in the face, after which she asked why she had suddenly started acting like that. She must have come here with some strange plan. Then she said she was not going to succeed this time, while the maid was tying her up, And the aunt, still angry, said that it was strange that the girl had changed so suddenly. Then she came closer and looked at her unhappily, wondering how such an arrogant scum dared to pretend to be a mistress behind her back. Then she said that she probably should have been much stricter with this girl, and said that Aurora Garnet had craved her attention since she was a little girl. And remembering the girl as a child, she said she should have killed her then, for she was of no use. Then, swinging around to slap her in the face, again said that if she had actually killed her when she was a child, she wouldn't have had such a problem with her behavior, but said that Avrenia Garnet was insanely lucky that she was insanely busy today. So going out the door, she smilingly announced that Avrenia Garnet would sit here during the ceremony, after which their conversation would continue, and she seemed to feel great satisfaction. After which she informed the girl that she should not even think about making noise, and closed the doors but to such a thing, and the protagonist reacted with a smile, because she realized that she already had a plan, and such an attitude will not remain simply forgotten on her part. As a result, at that time her aunt came to her husband and calmly informed him that the girl had been captured. He just nodded contentedly and said that it was really great news, and now that all the disturbances had been eliminated, everything was sure to go according to plan. At this time, the joyful and a bit excited personal maid of the main character was walking to the kitchen and thought that, as expected, her mistress was really incredible, and all the chocolate she'd prepared was eaten. So she wondered if the other people liked what she had prepared. But at that moment, Yuzin Peridot approached her with his assistant and turned to the girl and asked if he could also try some chocolate. But she only awkwardly apologized and said that she had just left the last chocolate, which had already been eaten. At the sight of such an excited girl, he calmly said that everything was all right because he was not really hungry. But everyone ate it with such an appetite that he himself became curious. But this moment he was interested in the voice of the Count, who informed everyone that the farewell ceremony was over and that the head of the Garnet family, Duke Thorn, was now in critical condition. So it was time to say goodbye to him, and informed everyone that he would see them off. In the end, everyone gathered in the temple where they read prayers, and at this time the father of the protagonist excitedly looked around at all the guests, absolutely did not understand where his daughter disappeared. After all, the girl probably heard the bell ringing, which meant that the service has already begun. Then with shaking hands realized that perhaps something happened to her. At this point, I cannot turn to his brother, who with a smile asked if he was all right. But the man, only agitated, bowed his head and said that he was just worried where his daughter had disappeared, because she was not the kind of person who would leave at a time like this. And then his brother calmly touched his shoulder and said that it must have been hard for the girl to accept the death of her grandfather, and maybe she was just crying somewhere, and advised him not to worry so much, because she needed some time alone. But at that moment, the protagonist had already managed to free herself from her confinement, and she realized that her aunt and uncle had been foolish enough to hope that some ropes would hold her back. Just about that time, the Count rose from his seat and announced that it was time to announce the next heir to the Duchy of Garnet, after which he looked around at all the people, but the title of the Duchy of Garnet will be assumed by the Count of Rothen, since the Duke had already appointed the Count as his successor, and all the family members had agreed to it. The heads of the other families should treat him as a duke from now on. But at that moment, raising his hand, Yuzin Peridot calmly looked at the man and wondered why he was in such a great hurry to take the Duke's place. After all, you can't make an announcement immediately after the funeral is over, and wondered if there were reasons to announce it as here and now. But the man only excitedly informed that his father had already died, and they would be sad for a long time. But although it was an insanely sad event, but the family cannot be in mourning forever. But at that moment, the protagonist burst into the room and said that in that case, she wanted to be given time to say goodbye to her grandfather. Her uncle looked at the girl in shock and literally could not believe his eyes. She looked at his face and explained that she had heard the sound of the bell and wanted to come right away. After that, the girl approached her grandfather and all around excitedly asked what she was going to do. But she calmly said she wanted to pray for her grandfather one last time, and asked if she could recite the Street Estella prayer. But at that moment, she was approached by one of the guests who asked her. But she calmly said that the reason she had chosen that particular prayer was because Estelle was the most important saint in the empire, and so she chose her prayer. Then she thought that now she could anger her enemies, but not anger God. So she asked God not to deny her prayer. Then she bent over her grandfather and turned to the great light and said that she believed in his love. So she asked that this light might illuminate them, and also that God would forgive them all their evil intentions and bless all those gathered here, and guide them to the path of truth, and guide the feet of their enemies along the path of despair, and shine a bright light on good men, that everlasting peace may arrive, and let the enemies feel the torments of hell squirming in pain. Whereupon, kissing her grandfather's hand, she turned to God and informed him that if God really loved her, she wanted him to bless her and help her get what she desired. And at that moment, to the shock of everyone present, her grandfather opened his eyes and looked intently at his granddaughter. Shortly before this event, the little boy was approached by a servant who informed him that he had received an invitation, and the boy excitedly inquired. The servant only confirmed his conjecture and inquired how he could know about it, but he calmly informed him that a few days ago he had received the revelation. Then, leaning back in his chair, he said that the revelation was that he could meet his destiny there. The servant was madly surprised and asked who had foretold it to him, but the boy only calmly informed that he had predicted it for himself. So it could be said that he could just predict the future, and if he attended the farewell ceremony, he could meet someone there. Someone who was the mighty Saint Estella herself, and then excited. Looking around the main character, the boy realized that this must have been his destiny, and his destiny was exactly Arenia Garnet. While her father and her uncle were excitedly stating that their father had come to his senses, the protagonist only looked at them calmly and thought about the fact that she had heard the Count's heartbeat, and it was the heartbeat of someone who was afraid that the truth about the poisoning would come out. But the next moment, all the guests excitedly surrounded Abraham Garnet and told her what it was. Apparently, it was holy power, and reported that the last time they had seen such a beautiful glow was at Street Estella's. The girl just calmly said that perhaps during the prayer they were blessed by the heavens, and she thought that she had no other choice. And this powerful force of darkness she received from the devil for 600 years of suffering. And even if it wasn't real light, no one here would ever be able to know about it. Then she thought that she would never be able to return to her normal life as a saint, but she was ready to use this power as her weapon. Then she decided that by using such power, she could demonstrate it to remind everyone present of the crime against Street Estella, so that they would all continue to live in great fear. And so it was. And everyone present was shocked that Arenia Garnet had received God's blessing, and it was the birth of a new saint after Fiandra. Looking over the nervous Fiandra, the protagonist stated that her power of light was quite small compared to her power in her previous life. It was all due to the fact that she had gotten that power because she had sacrificed it. At that moment, her father shielded the girl from everyone present and asked them to stop and not to question his daughter about everything that had happened, and then apologized and said that his daughter's health was very fragile, so they should go back. They tried to say something else, but the man only covered the girl with him and told them that it was really time to leave them alone. Then he looked carefully at his daughter and asked if she was all right, and said that they should leave. Then pulled his daughter with him and told the steward to get the carriage ready, as they needed to get Aurelie of Garnet away. But at that moment she pulled her hand out and told him that everything was really fine. She looked at him carefully and asked if her father should visit her grandfather, and warned him that even if she felt bad, she wouldn't ask him to take care of her. She explained with a smile that she and her father had never really been close enough, and to be honest, she was just a little uncomfortable. Then she dreamed of Street Estelle, that is her past life, and then she remembered how she had convinced herself that if she prayed well, she could truly become part of the family. And if she wanted her fiancé to love her, she also had to pray constantly for their happiness together. But the next moment, the devil, stretching out his hands to her, informed her that the girl's prayers were so earnest that they had at last reached even him. After which he grabbed her hand and informed her that she was a foolish enough child, and so he was ready to lavish her with his love. After which he began to chain her in his chains. And at that moment, the girl woke up and she didn't understand at all why she was having such a nightmare right now. At that moment, a worried maid came running up to her and looked at her and asked if she was all right. But Arenia Garnet assured her that everything was all right, and she was just having a nightmare. She was sweating profusely, but Arenia Garnet assured her that everything was fine and that she was only having a nightmare. Then the excited maid went on and told the girl that it was probably due to the events of yesterday. When she heard about it, the protagonist wondered what happened next, and the maid, smiling happily, said that the Duke was looking for her, and therefore she should immediately pack and go to him. In the end, she did so, and when she entered the room, she saw her joyful grandfather, who was madly happy to see his granddaughter, because finally he could wait for her. The girl just came up and hugged him tightly. The man then asked his granddaughter how she was able to develop her power so quickly. But Arenia Garnet smiled and said that she was just thinking about her grandfather and praying for him with all her heart. At this point, the man lay back on his bed again in order not to be overworked and smiling happily stroked the protagonist's head and informed her that their princess was madly worried about her grandfather, and afterwards thanked her for such a thing and informed her that Abrinia Garnet's holy power was much stronger than Fiandra's, for his body was not only recovered, but rejuvenated. The girl only smiled and said that her grandfather really overestimated her. But then she remembered that when she made the contract with Hamilton, she had also shortened his life. And so the Duke's body had been rejuvenated for 6 months. And now she definitely needed the Duke's trust, so she had no other choice. So she smiled and said that she still didn't understand how it had happened, but she was madly happy that he was able to wake up, and the grandfather only wondered how he could repay his granddaughter for such a rescue, and asked what she wanted, because he was ready to do anything. The protagonist only smilingly announced that she wanted the Duke to help her break her engagement with the Crane Prince and arrange a marriage with the Grand Duke of Peridot. Grandfather only looked her over excitedly and inquired, did she definitely wish to break her engagement with the Crown Prince? But she persuaded him something was indeed her wish. Then the man, looking closely at his granddaughter, said that she must realize that it was not all that simple. After all, the early girl had made this engagement on her own. The protagonist only thought about the fact that Absolute did not know that it was the desire of Aurinia Garnet to marry the Crown Prince, so this surprised her very much. At that moment, there was a voice of the Duke, who said that it was not so difficult to break the engagement, and that he do not need to get closer to the imperial family. But he had to know the reason why the girl changed her mind. But she exhaled and announced in all seriousness that she wanted to be a member of a loyal Garnet, not an empress without influence, and she wanted to be the pride of the family that shines her light. Then the girl thought about the fact that the symbol of the Aurinia Garnet family was the pomegranate. However, their loyalty belonged neither to a dynasty nor to a nation, but only to their family for the sake of prosperity. At this point, a grandpa laughed and said that he had absolutely not expected such a desire from the protagonist, and wondered. The grandfather laughed and said that he did not expect such a desire from the main character. But the girl, remembering her past life with a smile, said that there was an event in her life when she almost died, and that's why she wanted to change her life. Then, looking at the girl carefully, the grandfather said that apparently Aurinia Garnet had been scared out of her wits by the accident, but she had assured him that everything was all right and they had nothing to worry about now. Having heard her wish and seen her determination, the man agreed and asked her where she wanted to start as part of the faithful. But at that moment, the protagonist, with a sly smile, informed that the best idea would be to find her grandfather's poisoner to begin with. After all, they had trespassed on the heart of the family. So she had to find out who was responsible for it and make that person accept the most horrible death possible. At this point, the man thought about the fact that his granddaughter was absolutely not joking when she said she wanted to be faithful, and she was much better than his own son Enrique, and thought he should have kept a better eye on his son, as he suspected him of poisoning. Then she looked at her granddaughter and asked if she needed help in catching the criminal, but she said she would not refuse and said she would like to visit the Baroness in person. The man only smiled happily and informed her that he gave his full consent, and warned her that he would contact the Crown Prince today, and she need not worry about him from now on. Then he asked his granddaughter carefully for what reason she wanted to marry Juzin, and she smiled and said that if she married him, they could get the Grand Duke. And unlike the others, she thought only of the advantages that their family could get, because the current situation of the duchy was so bad that all direct descendants died 15 years ago, so that when she marries Juzena, the Garnet will be able to swallow up the duchy entirely, too. And she would like the Garnet to shine more brightly than any other stone of the six.